Hello, and welcome to the Newsmakers interview series with Marvin Olasky. Our interviewee tonight is Mr. Ken Myers, the host, writer, and producer of Mars Hill Audio Journal, a bi-monthly audio magazine that examines contemporary issues from Christian conviction. Myers is a Christian audio journalist from Virginia with years of experience as editor at various journals, magazines, and news programs, including Morning Edition and All Things Considered. Mr. Myers is also a contributing editor for Christianity Today. He is married and has 2 children and lives in Central Virginia. Let's welcome Ken Myers.
Ken, who said a pastor who said I speak as a dying man to dying men?
I can't remember who said that.
I can't remember it either. It just occurred to me, but I just want to start out by...
It sounds like Spurgeon.
Could be Spurgeon, but just want to start out mentioning that Ken Myers is here tonight, but 4 years ago, he suffered a heart attack that, according to the doctors, only 20% of the people who do that...
Actually, 4% survival rate.
4% survive. So, in other words, it's a miracle that Ken's here. And since most of you are 20 years old or so and think you're immortal, maybe Ken could talk just a little bit, starting out, about that experience of mortality.
Yeah. Well, it happened 4 years ago. In fact, I just celebrated my anniversary last week. It was the 5th of November. And I was 58, in pretty good health, never had high cholesterol. I've been doing some exercising. I was moderately overweight, but not horribly so, and I won't go into all the details, but very subtle symptoms which I would not have known was a heart attack were it not for the Mayo Clinic website that I happened on and saw, gee, I'm having a heart attack.
Research.
Yeah, a little research. And the EMTs came to the house, called 911, called 911. They put me in the ambulance, called for a helicopter right away. Before the helicopter could arrive, my heart stopped. And I woke up about 11 or 12 hours later in the hospital. My first thought was, that was a strange dream, but realizing that actually everything I remembered up to that point had happened. And then I realized that I found out later that my heart had actually stopped 3 times, once in the ambulance, twice then in the hospital, that I had irregular heart rhythm for hours and hours after that, and that they were concerned about the possibility of significant brain damage. They were talking about like a 4 to 6 month recovery time. My board of directors was making plans to what to do with Mars Hill Audio when I drop out of the picture. But the short story is, within 72 hours of calling the EMTs, I was at Whole Foods buying some iced tea and on my way home from the hospital. It was amazing. And it really was a miracle. I mean, it has affected my theology in that now I now believe prayers are answered before they're prayed, because I've met hundreds of people who were praying for me on that day. They, kind of went viral, as my sister said, the fact that this was happening, and people, total strangers who were praying for me. But they were praying after the things that happened that actually saved my life. A number of things happened that did save my life. But ultimately, the doctors say I shouldn't be here. So it was. It was dramatic. Unfortunately, I slept through most of the drama. I mean, I often say this is the most dramatic event of my life, and I slept through it. My wife and daughter did not sleep through it, and I think it's every now and then we talk about what they were going through, because I just have all the benefits of this great miracle in my life, and they had all the suffering kind of leading up to it.
Now, when you woke up, you had a real sense of gratitude, you mentioned.
Once I woke up and realized what happened, I just a sense of a great gratefulness that I was alive, and that just blossomed over the course of the next weeks, actually, when I realized that I really should not have survived. But then within actually just a couple of days of that, I realized, you're thinking, I've been given my life back. I've been given my life back. Well, then I realized, it was never really mine to begin with. It was always given to me. It was a gift from the time I was born. And so I realized I should have been as grateful for being alive my whole life as I was because I just avoided death, by the skin of my teeth. And that, I've been doing a lot of interviews on theology of gift and ideas of gratitude and all these things as theoretical things. And suddenly they hit me existentially, and they're in my life. And it has affected, I'm still really interested in theology of gift, but now when I read those things, or when I recite the Nicene Creed and refer to the Holy Spirit as the Lord and giver of life, giver is not just a kind of utilitarian transaction. It's much richer to me.
Okay. And thus, for the 20-year-olds among us, a gift.
Be as grateful as if you just almost died.
Right. Without having to go through that.
Without having to go through what I went through.
Right.
And I had a helicopter ride, and I didn't even see it. I mean, everybody wants to have a helicopter ride, but not while they're unconscious.
Right. So, thinking back now, high school, college, that's when you were reading first C.S. Lewis's books?
Yeah, I was reading C.S. Lewis in high school. I can't remember when I first read Mere Christianity. And unfortunately, I didn't know about the Chronicles of Narnia until relatively late. I mean, a lot of young people today, including my kids, are exposed to them, very, very early on. But I came from a family, all four of my grandparents were committed Christians. Almost all my aunts and uncles and cousins were committed Christians. 3 of my mother's brothers were missionaries, one in Vietnam, one in India, one in Africa. And so I grew up in a church that was very committed to missions. And in fact, it was the Christian Missionary Alliance denomination, which had at that time the highest per member representation of full-time missionaries of any denomination in the world, I think. And growing up in that setting, there was a sense that if you had to have a calling to not be a missionary. Right. It was assumed that was the default position. And so that made me think a lot as a kid about sharing the gospel with people, about making the gospel plausible to people. And so I got interested in works of apologetics of C.S. Lewis's pretty early on.
Okay, so you had the family background early on, then you had C.S. Lewis early on, and then also I understand you had a couple of extraordinary music teachers in high school, and so that became integrated into your thinking.
Arts, yeah. And so early on, and in fact, I had an uncle who was very interested in classical music, and he actually is the one who introduced me to Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. He introduced me to the novels of Charles Williams when I was in college. And so I had a sense early on, partly from Lewis, partly from other experiences, that there was no inherent conflict between a serious interest in the arts and a serious commitment to Christianity. And so when I was in high school in the late 60s, I had 2 music teachers, one of whom was the cantor at the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington. He had studied for the priesthood, decided not to be a priest, was a music teacher. So I was learning a lot of sacred choral music from the 16th century on. And I was exposed, one of the other teachers had studied in Paris with Nadia Boulanger, who has been called the most influential teacher since Socrates, which is pretty serious. She trained more 20th century musicians and composers, from Aaron Copland to Quincy Jones. So here I was in a public high school in Prince George's County, Maryland, with these remarkable people who were helping me see links between the truth and goodness of the gospel and the beauty of the arts. And that was there was no discontinuity in my experience.
But with all that, when you go to college, you plan to major in engineering.
Because that was, I was interested, I always did well in math and science. And a lot of my friends thought I would major in music because I was involved in music performance. but I couldn't imagine making a living doing that and trying to figure out, well, what do I do to make a living? And so I started in electrical engineering.
And your dad might be perhaps the only dad in history to actually suggest to a student engaged in a major that's going to lead to very nice material benefits to go and instead become a writer.
It's funny you remember that. Yeah, I can remember I was in high school. In fact, I was getting in my car, my old Plymouth Valiant, with Kathy Hoover, my girlfriend, in my senior year in high school. I don't know why I remember this so vividly. We're leaving my parents' house, going out and getting my car, and Dad had read something I'd written. He said, "You should be a writer." And I thought that was the stupidest thing imaginable, because I thought writing, I thought writers were like demigods. They were people who were just like prophetic, and I thought I could never write anything. So I had such respect, especially not only people who wrote, but people who wrote and got published, of course, by an actual publisher in print, which still may be rare. But but my dad also, I don't know if you know this story, I may have told you this story once. I wanted to go to Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken to study engineering. And it's one of the few times my dad ever intervened. He was always kind of hands-off, but he said, no, I think you ought to go to the University of Maryland. They have a really good engineering department. And there are two reasons why I don't think you should go to Stevens Institute of Technology. And I said, what? I really had my heart set on this really serious technical institute. He said, well, first of all, he says, you really like music, and you'll have no courses in music at this technical institute. I said, okay. And the second thing is, you really like girls, and there are almost no girls at that school. Well, that convinced me.
So what a great father, because I suspect, others of you, some of you here who perhaps are majoring in literature or something else, and I can imagine the discussion with dads at times where he may say, but why don't you do something where you'll be able to earn a living?
Yeah.
And you say, well, I want to just follow what I believe. And how often is it reversed?
Yeah. My dad never pushed us to do anything practical. And I think part of it was, if you're not going to be a missionary, it doesn't much matter what you're going to do anyway. That may have been part of it.
So, and then you started you're at University of Maryland, and you get involved with the campus radio station.
Yeah, I actually, I was still not sure what I was going to do as a major. But I'd been interested. I was a serious radio listener. NPR had actually just started in the early 70s. I also used to listen to Gene Shepard, who was a radio storyteller. Gene Shepard was kind of like Garrison Keillor of an earlier generation. He's just this brilliant raconteur. And I used to listen to him late at night. And I thought, wow, radio is such an intimate medium for storytelling, and it's so personal. I also used to love listening. Willard Scott and Eddie Walker were on WRC here in Washington, AM station. And they used to have an afternoon drive program where they would do all kinds of sketches, and it was, I don't think there's any radio like it now. And so I always enjoyed radio. But then I thought, I was a sophomore in college, and I thought I thought that it would be a good idea to try to do a Christian radio program that would combine some music, but also we actually did dramatized versions of the Screw Tape Letters without getting permission from the publisher. So we could have gotten sued, I'm sure. I had poetry readings. I had people writing commentaries. It was kind of like, I don't know, all things considered. It wasn't news though. It was kind of commentary, and they gave me initially a half hour Sunday mornings, and then eventually 90 minutes on Thursday nights at the campus radio station. And it was producing that program that made me think about majoring in communications, which was radio, television, and film at Maryland.
Now, Christian radio now is not known particularly for a whole lot of thoughtful programs and that.
Well-
Was it any better then?
No, it wasn't much better then. In fact, I worked for one of the first Christian radio stations here in the D.C. area, WCTN. It may still be on the air. It's 8:50 a.m. It went on the air while I was still in college, and I was hired as an afternoon drive disc jockey, playing proto-CCM stuff. It was before there was CCM. But in between songs, we were encouraged to kind of like talk to people and, make comments. Well, I was sharing the reading I was doing. I was reading Pascal's Pensées at the time, so I would share little insights from Blaise Pascal in between Larry Stonehill, or Larry Norman and Randy Stonehill song, which wasn't quite what the management had in mind. And then I did some other, I actually read aloud, again, breaking copyright law, the first 3 Chronicles of Narnia on Saturday morning. I had a Saturday morning show that was actually a bluegrass show, and where I mixed secular but also a lot of Christian bluegrass. And I was also some other folk music, not just bluegrass.
Okay.
It was called Unsquare Roots, and the first, kind of like that.
Bring a little bit of the engineering back.
Yeah,
into it.
my engineering thing. Yeah, I still I had that slide rule in my pocket, but so I worked at this Christian radio station, and I was I think trying to do some innovative things there. They fired me. It's the only time I've ever been fired from any job, and I was told in these words, "You're too creative for Christian radio." We agreed on that. And a year later, I was working at NPR, actually.
And tell us what you did at NPR for 8 years, right? Where you were known
a
as
total of 8 years, either full-time or as a stringer.
You were known as the resident fascist?
Well, I jokingly say, no, I jokingly say I was the token fascist. But no, I was in the arts department. I had a friend who'd gone to college, worked at the campus radio station, brilliant guy, ended up becoming vice president of programming at NPR. Has worked at CNN and CBS and NBC. He went to NPR straight out of college. A year later, he called me. He said, "There's a perfect job for you. It's production assistant in the arts department," which involved editing interviews with people in the arts, authors, actors, directors, musicians, which were used as kind of intermission features and filler on local stations. And so I went in for an interview. I had a reel of some of my best work in college radio. And we did, the college radio, I did two classical music shows. I also did an arts magazine show in college. I did the Christian show, but that was just the way of getting started. So my senior year, I produced an arts magazine show. In fact, the very first week, J.R.R. Tolkien died, and I produced an obit for Tolkien. I think John Ford, the director, died about the same time I did. So I started doing these tribute pieces. Anyway, I had all this reel of stuff that I could, and that helped me get the job at NPR. So I started off in the arts division. When I went to NPR, I think I first ran across the phrase post-Christian in some writings by Dorothy L. Sayers, who, if you've not read Dorothy L. Sayers, you really need to read Dorothy L. Sayers. Not just the Lord Peter Wimsey novels, read those, but also read a lot of her essays and her cultural commentary.
Collected in a book called?
They were collected in a book, I think it was called A Matter of Eternity was the book. But she used the phrase post-Christian. And then I found there was an essay by Lewis where he talks about Europe enduring its dechristening. And I think Francis Schaeffer may have talked about post-Christian also. Going to work at NPR was kind of working in a post-Christian setting. And I was curious, how did we get here? How did our culture get here? A lot of the people I was working with were people who'd grown up in churches of one kind or another. What made them leave the church? What is it about the cultural moment that we're in? This is 1975, I started working there. How did our culture get to the point where the continuity that I had learned in high school to recognize between a Christian understanding of reality and the best expressions of the arts? Why is it that now Christianity is over here, the church is over here, and the arts are over here, and there's this mutual antagonism and suspicion between them? How did we get here? And that began a 40-year long and continuing effort to try to understand how contemporary culture got to where it was. I think a lot of Christians are interested, they recognize the disorder of the culture and they want to do something about it. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, the usual response is to do something political about it, not something cultural. Politics is always downstream of culture, so you have to figure out, okay, the political problems we have with something like same-sex marriage, for instance, that's expressive of a cultural disorder. So how do we get to the point where certain things are plausible and certain things are implausible within a culture? And I realized I needed better theological training to understand that. So after 2.5 years of working in NPR, I went to Westminster Seminary. I was still doing freelance work for NPR the whole time I was in seminary, particularly with the poet John Ciardi. I used to produce a weekly spot with John Ciardi, who was doing a series of things on the etymology of English words and phrases.
So at this point, you have one leg in the Christian world, in a sense, another leg in the NPR world.
Yeah.
Very different.
Very different worlds, yeah. And so, on Sundays, one of the ways I describe this, on Monday through Friday, I worked with people who took creativity really seriously, but they didn't believe in a creator. And Sunday, I worshiped and fellowshiped with people who took the creator very seriously, but were suspicious of creativity. And I've come to realize that part of that was because of an atrophied understanding of the doctrine of creation, I think. I think they believed they had separated redemption from creation in their own theological framework. I talked to a pastor recently. He says, I know a lot of Christians who think the Bible starts with Genesis 3, with the account of the fall. Even one of my great heroes, J. Gresham Machen, who founded the seminary I went to, he has a book called A Christian View of Man. I pulled it off the shelf a few years ago. I was reading books on theological anthropology. I thought, well, how did Machen treat this? Turns out the Christian view of man is that he's fallen. What I wanted was something that dealt with what's the meaning of the relationship between soul and body, how do we live in history, a theological explanation of all aspects of our humanity. And unfortunately, Machen's book was just, we're fallen and we need a savior.
But Adam had to be very creative in naming the animals.
Yeah. It was both creative. I used to think naming the animals. My engineering side, it was basically taxonomy, but now I think it was more an act of poetry in some way, or both. And and I think the emphasis on the beauty of creation that's in Old and New Testament, the goodness of creation is tied to the beautifulness of creation, which is not superseded by the fall. The beauty of creation is proclaimed despite the fall and the curse. But again, there are reasons historically why I think Christianity, particularly in the late 19th, early and through the 20th century, adopted almost a Gnostic posture toward creation.
By which you mean?
A suspicion of the meaningfulness and goodness of embodied experience. I gave a talk recently about the necessity to have confidence that creation is intelligible through the senses. That is, we can learn through our sense experience, not just through our minds, but we learn through the experience of the senses, through the shape of the intelligibility of creation. A lot of wisdom literature is based on observation of creation, which then, because creation contains analogies of supernatural realities, or what some would call sacramental participation in supernatural reality.
And journalism is based on observation.
Yeah. Right. Oh, yeah. Journalism is based on observation, and the best journalism tells stories. So it has to be, it's not just factual spreadsheet kind of observation. It's an effort to wisely represent what is happening in a narrative form, I think.
So Westminster, and then you go back to full-time work at NPR.
Well, that's the funny thing. I went to Westminster, and while I left NPR I didn't plan on going back. I thought what I wanted to do was to help other lay people. I thought I've had this incredible experience as growing up with Christians all around me, really good Christian education in school, and I wasn't ready to work in this professional post-Christian setting. Most people don't even have the benefit that I had of the kind of training I had. So I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful to do something that was kind of a cross between L'Abri and the Ligonier Valley Study Center? This is before R.C. Sproul. He used to have a residential study center. So I wanted to get involved in some kind of effort to help people understand theology and culture in a either residential or some kind of tutorial mode. I wanted to basically get involved in Christian education. I graduated, finished seminary, couldn't find anybody that was interested in hiring me to do that. And meanwhile, my old friend who'd gotten me my job originally at NPR was now the producer of Morning Edition, which was about ready to go on the air in 1979. And I was in D.C. working on some of these John Ciardi features, and it turned out he needed an arts editor. There'd been some shifting in the staff, and he had an opening for an arts editor. And he said, I said jokingly, I could do that job. Mm-hmm. He said, you could do that job. And suddenly my whole life changed, because I thought, maybe I could do that job. And so he brought me back to be, when Morning Edition went on the air, there was 9 minutes an hour of arts and humanities coverage, and I was in charge of those 2 9-minute segments.
But you didn't stay there. I mean, you then went to Eternity magazine?
I was laid off because of a budget crisis 4 years later.
Okay.
And then I looked for a job and couldn't find anything in Christian broadcasting that was interesting. Eternity magazine, which was then a monthly evangelical magazine, with a circulation of about 35,000, had been around since the late 40s. They were looking for somebody with secular journalistic experience and theological training who could kind of reimagine and refocus the magazine editorially. And that's when we met. Because I was looking for new writers who could comment on cultural issues. I basically, I wanted to do cultural journalism, not to use cultural experience as an object lesson to make an essentially theological point, but to use a theologically informed worldview to tell the story about what's going on culturally. And they asked me to present a plan for what the magazine could do, and I presented that plan. They approved it, but after a year of seeing what that actually looked like, the board of directors said, we don't really like that. There aren't enough Bible verses. And I was surprised, because they had been so enthusiastic when I started. And I think it's because what they were expecting, I think they misheard me, because they were still living with this kind of dualism where the culture's out there and then we have our spiritual lives in here. And they don't really have a lot to do with each other, but we can use object lessons from the world of culture to make points about justification or sanctification or something in here. But to actually do something about trends in commerce or trends in the arts, theologically understood, that they couldn't quite grasp.
So in a way, they did not want close observation. They were looking for things that could then become sermon illustrations, right, but not actually looking at the things themselves.
Yeah, and not actually evaluating the things from a rich theological understanding.
And that didn't work in a lot of ways, including Eternity. Eternity ended.
Yeah,
Eternity
the end
went
of
out
Eternity.
business.
Yeah, fortunately, I left before the end of Eternity. And the irony is I ended up editing a journal called This World. So I've been the editor of This World and Eternity.
And This World ended too, right?
Yeah, This World ended too. This World was not my home.
Right.
Yeah, I worked for Richard John Newhouse editing a quarterly journal, which was the predecessor to First Things.
First Things. So you come out of it then with these experiences from NPR, these experiences, not entirely happy ones, from Christian radio.
Yeah.
And so at that point, basically, you try to create your own Christian radio through what now would be podcasting. At that point,
I invented
tapes.
the podcast before there was the internet. Al Gore and I worked together on this. No, actually, I wanted to do radio programming. I thought, I said, conservative Christians kvetch a lot. Can I use Yiddish on your show?
Absolutely.
They kvetch a lot about media bias. And I thought, what if I got a program on NPR member stations that had an implicit Christian worldview? a half-hour arts and humanities magazine, because NPR was becoming more and more politicized. It was doing, hipster alt-rock stuff, nothing on the Western tradition, which is what NPR used to treat. So I thought, well, maybe I could find funding to do a half-hour arts magazine show that could be carried on NPR member stations. I went to about 25 foundations and got turned down by all of them.
And if those foundations had said yes, NPR would have made room for it. Is that?
Well, see, the thing is with NPR, anybody can go to NPR member stations. The programming isn't centrally decided.
Right.
So all I would have to do is find some sympathy at the local level for a program like that, and because a certain percentage of local programming is produced by non-NPR members. So Prairie Home Companion is not an NPR program.
So what does it mean that you went 25 places and no one had the creative vision to want to?
Well, again, I think, I like to say it's like back in the 80s when we were debating about the great books and the loss of great books curriculum, I used to say that conservatives are more interested in defending the great books than actually having to read them. And I think that it's more interesting to kvetch about media bias than it is to produce media that actually is biased in the right way, or that's actually representing a point of view, and particularly with regard to the arts. And I think if I'd been doing something on politics, I probably could have found funding. But I do think this is a weakness both among political social conservatives and with Christians. The interest in the arts, the interest in how the imagination takes form institutionally and historically just isn't there. But I'm convinced you can only believe what you can imagine. Just as politics is downstream from culture, there's a sense in which our reasoning about things is downstream from imagination. C.S. Lewis says imagination is the organ of meaning and reason is the organ of truth. So we learn through our imaginations about the nature of meaning of things. And then we can evaluate later, in a sense, rationally, whether or not things are true. So I've long thought that Christians need to give much more attention to how people imagine reality.
Do you think that the success over the past decade of the LGBT movement has finally shown Christians that culture comes first? And
I keep hoping.
Yeah.
I mean, for decades, I've hoped finally Christians will pay attention to what. Maybe. I mean, the LGBT movement. This gets to a question I'm really interested in. I think one of the great crises of modernity generally, of the modern era, depending on when you start that, either with the Enlightenment or William of Ockham, there's somewhere in between William of Ockham and the Enlightenment.
Or William Clinton.
Or yeah. One of the great modern mistakes is the assumption that there's no order to reality, that reality is inherently meaningless. Or David Bentley Hart wrote a brilliant essay in First Things years ago called Christ and Nothing. He said, to the extent that we are modern, we believe in nothing. That is, it's not to say that we don't believe in anything, but we believe in the nothing. We believe in nothingness. That is, we believe that anterior to our choosing, to our wills, there's nothing that would guide our wills. So sheer willing, the sovereignty of the individual self, is the ultimate reality. And I think most people believe, and that's why, to use the vocabulary of sexual preference, like the pro-choice movement, it appeals to the sovereignty of choosing as the ultimate reality. What could possibly guide our choosing? Nothing, because there's nothing there that could guide our choosing.
Well, Anthony Kennedy has now said that's basically the leading axiom of American politics.
That's the essence of American freedom, the American notion of freedom. And there's a sense in which he's right, because you can see the idea of freedom, an untethered, unguided freedom, begins to emerge in the relatively early modern period, philosophically and in some instances theologically even. So to be able to imagine that creation is ordered, I think one of the attractions to something like, to great mythic stories like Lord of the Rings, for instance, is it presents an ordered, it's good and evil, not just as the obedience of laws, but it's good and evil as a kind of metaphysical battle where goodness has this rich presence, and evil is a kind of, as Augustine would say, a kind of the absence of goodness. It's a negative thing. So I think that people need to be able to imagine that the world is, that creation is ordered before they will vote for legislation that confirms the specific nature of its order. And I think there are a lot of experiences that give a sense that chaos, that our willing is the thing that keeps chaos at bay. Not that there's an ultimate goodness and order and beauty. You know, David Bentley Hart, I mentioned, he wrote a book called The Beauty of the Infinite. And part of the theme, it's a very difficult book to read. I won't commend it to, except for trained professionals on a closed course. But basically, he points out that in a lot of postmodern thought, the assumption is that violence and chaos are the ultimate foundational realities, rather than love and beauty. And the Christian account is that love and beauty are the foundational realities. Love and beauty are ordered. There's a great phrase that Pope Benedict uses called the logos that is love. The logos that is love. Christ, the orderer of all creation, but it's a personal, loving orderer of all creation. So if that's in your imagination, if your imagination is shaped to perceive that order as a kind of fundamental reality, then it's easier to believe in it. That's why I say you can only believe in what you can imagine.
So there's a lot of music of the past several decades, ranging from, say, John Cage to some heavy metal, assume that chaos is the center of our existence?
Well, you know, I just wrote a piece I write a column on music for Touchstone, and I wrote a piece about Arvo Pärt, the Estonian composer, just turned 80 years old, a major 20th century figure, who in the 50s and 60s was writing in the school of what's called serialism, which involves the abandonment of any kind of traditional notions of harmony. So you basically construct harmony the way you want to. You have your harmonic preferences, okay? It has a system to it, it has a kind of order, but it's an arbitrary order. And this came about in the late 19th century. I mean, Mahler's Ninth Symphony, someone described as the death of harmony. You can hear in the music that this loss of confidence. You know, he writes it about the same time Nietzsche says God is dead. So throughout Western culture in the late 19th century, there's this sense of the receding tide of meaning. You know, Dover Beach, Matthew Arnold. Where are we going to go for meaning? And in music in particular, it happens with regard to traditional notions of harmony. That is, there's an order to creation, which people believe from the time of Pythagoras until the 19th century. There's an order in creation that can be known harmonically through the expression of harmony, as well as melody. I mean, use harmony in its biggest sense, which would include other musical elements as well. Anyway, so you see movements in the early 20th century of so-called serialism, which is basically we invent harmony on our terms. Arvo Pärt was schooled in serialism, but you can hear he's not happy with this as a composer. He would often juxtapose these beautiful moments of what we call consonance with dissonance. And it's almost like, you know, moving from this absolute chaos to a beautiful garden. And he got to a point where he just couldn't keep writing the chaos. He stopped composing music entirely for several years, started listening to Gregorian chant and early medieval polyphony, very simple harmonic structures. And he kind of relived the history of Western music in about 2 years. I think it took him 2 years to write a second melodic line. He was writing single melodic lines, and so he kind of rediscovered what harmony was, and he has this incredibly simple harmonic structure in the music that emerges. But I think his story is a kind of a case study, and there's another great story. There's George Rochberg, who's a 20th century American composer, who again, he was the poster child for 12-tone or serial music. And suddenly, I think again, it was in the 70s, he started writing what people were saying was neo-romantic music, because suddenly it sounded beautiful again. Suddenly beauty was emerging, it was rearing its ugly head. And mid-20th century people are anxious about who let beauty in the door. And when asked, why are you returning to these traditional notions of harmony? He said, my son died, and I needed a vocabulary capable of expressing grief. And serialism did not give me a vocabulary for grief. It gave me a vocabulary for anxiety, and a vocabulary for violence, and a vocabulary for all sorts of negative things. But grief is not, strictly speaking, a negative emotion. It's not a violent emotion.
So he wanted to believe that there was something more than just violence and meaninglessness.
And he needed a vocabulary to be able to express it. You know, I find the same thing. I'm interested in how people respond to Bach's music and describe it. And I've seen many atheists who describe Bach's music as a kind of vision of transcendent order that they wish was true. And it's kind of like reading somebody who writes about unicorns. We wish there were unicorns, but of course, we know there's not. But what if it was? What if Bach was actually describing reality as it is?
Does the same thing happen in popular culture, that a lot of young people yearn for, let's say, the music of Frank Sinatra?
Well, I was interested to slightly different. You know, years ago I did an interview with Alan Jacobs about all of the Jane Austen films that were coming out. I mean, there's always new films based on, and I think it was Alan who said that people suffer from manners envy. They suffer from the sense they wish life could be ordered. I mean, Downton Abbey is another instance where people, here you have a hierarchical society with classes, and this ought to offend, and yet people have a sense, there's a sense of order there. They love it.
Or Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movies.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's a beauty there. There's a beauty of order. Now I think of a line. Roger Scruton he taught here or did some lecturing here at one point anyway. Scruton has written a lot about musical aesthetics, and he's written a lot about dance and music, and he says that in modern social dancing, people tend to dance at one another instead of with one another. And that's a great description. Again, you look at Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and they are dancing with each other, not at each other. And so there is, I think, so I think that you can find in music, but you can find in all of the arts, you can find expressions of the kind of underlying imaginative picture of reality that's the dominant picture of reality. It's interesting to me that people kind of latch on to musical forms of musical expression without actually paying attention to what the nature of the meaning of the musical expression is. One of the things I find with regard to popular music is often you ask them, why do you like this band or this song? Well, it's so raw and authentic. And then you ask them to tease out, well, what's good about being raw, first of all? I mean, unless it's sushi. What's good about being raw? And what do you mean by authenticity? And you tease that out a little bit more, and it means, well, it's unrefined, it's untrained, it's instinctual. So what that means is, to be authentically human means to be more like my dog, who actually has been more trained than mine. So the idea that to be authentic means not to have the kind of the formal expression of training. So there's definitely a kind of there's an expression of a kind of anthropology or cosmology that's present there. The other thing that's there was an interesting study by a group of Spanish social scientists a few years ago. I read about this in a journal where they took popular music from, I think, the late 50s to the present, and they figured out ways to digitize or quantify musical melodic characteristics of lots of music. And I remember the headline was, "Your parents were right, your music is dumber than their music was." That there actually is, you can graph particularly the harmonic and melodic complexity of music in a kind of steady decline for about 50 years. The only thing that went up was how loud it was. And so
that's authentic.
Yeah, because loud is authentic. And the result of they're using this data to say, well, then all people want to produce successful recordings. All they need to do is take older music, make it more stupid and louder, and then they can go to the bank, take that to the bank. So, but yeah, I think that how many young people? I don't know a lot of young people who say, I love this music because it's beautiful, because it orders my soul properly. That's pretty rare.
Well, let me turn to questions from you then. Yes, what does order your soul? What do you like?
In a virtuous way.
What do you like and why? Comments on music or other things here. Ken, by the way, wrote a book called All God's Children in Blue Suede Shoes about popular culture, and so he's ready to take whatever you throw at him, whether it's music or clothing or anything else. So questions, comments, thoughts?
Yeah.
Hi. A lot of times the church seems to be behind on cultural issues. By the time that it finally gets an opinion about the way something should or should not be, the culture outside of the church has already decided what their opinion is. For example, with evolution, by the time the church figured out that their response to evolution was going to be creationism, it had already been the dominant way of looking at the origins of the earth for 50 years. How do you think the church can better anticipate what the next cultural battleground will be and better prepare to have an answer when the world comes knocking?
Well, I think the best way would be to ask, one of the things I often suggest is that the church shouldn't think about culture in an apologetics mode at all. That is, I think the church's first way of thinking about culture, let's imagine everybody got saved tomorrow, then what would our cultural life look like Monday? So rather than asking, how can we respond in a reactionary way or reactive way to cultural changes, I want to start in a proactive way and say what cultural forms would best represent our way of understanding reality. So that then when the surrounding culture, and part of that is an assumption that I don't think we should think of the church as a subculture within a larger universal culture. I think the church is the true universal reality. And the things that are going on around the church are eruptions of that we need to be aware of and need to be wise about. But the idea that we need to position ourselves in light of the kinds of orientations or in light of the reference points provided by whatever moment we happen to be in. So I think that the idea of and not that there would be some kind of permanent static cultural form that we could achieve for all times, but to have ideas, to have a way of thinking about human cultural life that's informed by permanent realities, by eternal realities, which and to develop a set of theological understandings that have room for dealing with the world. Again, Cardinal Ratzinger once talked about we live in a society that is a faithless society, or a faithless world, but we have a worldless faith. That is, we don't have a faith that has room for the kinds of things cultures are. So we have a cultureless religion, and so we shouldn't be surprised that we have a religionless or an irreverent culture. And I think that reflects a lot of my experience in churches where Well, one example, years ago I interviewed Leon Cass, who wrote a book called The Hungry Soul, and it was reflecting on the meaning of the fact that we're creatures who need to eat in order to live. And I've never heard a sermon on a theology of eating or a theology of food. But it's really remarkable to ask, why does God make us as creatures who need to eat in order to live? We could have had photosynthetic skin or something like that. So to develop a theology of food and eating that then has consequences for how we order agriculture and meals and habits of eating, there are people doing that now, but that's something that should be part. There are all sorts of aspects of of human life that theology could address.
So why did God do that?
I think partly to remind us of our contingent existence, because it's interesting in the Old Testament, particularly in the Psalms, but throughout the Old Testament, when God's providence is described in concrete terms, the most common image of the providence of God for all of creation is food. He gives food to all of his creatures. And so I think that it's to remind us that our lives are not autonomous, that we're not autonomous beings, and that our life is given to us from God through the earth. We have to go back to dirt. We get our life from dirt, finally. But we get our life from dirt by the grace of God. And that's why I think one of the sacraments is a meal. I think that, and why the image of eschatology is a feast, finally. But it's always, in the Eucharist, however you understand it, this is my body. God gives us himself so that we might live. But again, our life is always given to us by God prior to that. So it gets back to gratitude.
Yeah. Other questions?
Ken, your suggestions and comments about imagination were helpful. And I wonder if you could give some recommendations on Christians who are doing the kind of work you're suggesting, maybe some literary fiction, film, and music that would be useful for us to engage in.
I don't know how many I know. I mean, well, let me start with music. But the music, people that come to mind immediately are kind of doing demanding things in music. So Arvo Pärt, which I think you can listen to easily, but to kind of grasp what's going on. There's a composer today named James McMillan who's also doing some really remarkable work. And one of the things about, I'll give preference to what we will call classical music or art music, partly because that's what I know best, but also because of the fact that somebody like McMillan, who's writing, he's in his mid-50s, he's writing music that's clearly from the 21st century, but it's from the 21st century as informed by 800 years or 1,000 years of music prior to him. So he's part of this continuity. If I'd ever rewritten All God's Children, Blue Suede Shoes, I think one of the things I would have talked about was the idea of culture as an inheritance rather than culture as a set of commodities that are autonomously chosen. And I think that this is one of the dilemmas of popular culture, is that I did talk about novelty as a kind of false god in there. But I've come to appreciate more and more how important it is to have a sense of continuity and long-term continuity. So, I'd mentioned Arvo Pärt, James McMillan, two composers who are doing remarkable stuff that is clearly, it's new, but it's also has a kind of eternal quality about it because of the fact that it's rooted in a long-standing tradition. I'm not sure how much I could recommend in literary fiction. I always, in terms of contemporary things being written, I tend to fall back on other 20th century writers like Walker Percy or Flannery O'Connor as writers that seem to me to be a model for that kind of imagination at work. And I don't know as much because I don't spend as much time with literary fiction. And And I'm not sure how much I could, and it's not because it's not there. I'm not sure in terms of film what I could commend. It's interesting. I have friends who are really interested in film as I have been. I don't pay as much attention to it now as I did earlier in life. I know a lot of people interested in film, Christians interested in film, who are basically trying to their agenda is basically what films are popular and how can we evaluate them in terms of a Christian worldview. I had one friend in Charlottesville. That was what he was always doing. You know, what are the Oscar nominees, and how can we evaluate them? Then I had another friend in Charlottesville, and his view was, oh, there's this Estonian film. This is Estonian filmmaker. He's done this incredible thing. Only 45 people have ever seen it in the world, but it's the best film. You should see this. And I like that. I like the idea. Like, let's find the best kind of expression, rather than saying let's find the most popular expression and how can we exploit it for apologetics reasons. I want to find let's find the best expression and delight in it. And so that means you end up finding things that aren't typically as marketable. But I just as a rule of thumb, that's why I will recommend with regard to film. There's a I actually hear more commentary about film than I actually see new films. There's a BBC program called The Film Program, a clever title, that I get on a podcast. And the woman, Francine Stock, who's the host of that show, is very, very intelligent. She and I would disagree about many things, but she has really intelligent conversations with directors and critics. And you know, I every time I hear that show, I think, why can't there be a Christian program that's as intelligent as this, and unapologetically thoughtful, and again, she clearly has opinions, as do we all. But I think to get a model of thoughtful conversation about film, I think that's something I'd recommend.
I'll recommend two podcasts, one of which is Ken's, Mars Hill Audio, which is a monthly magazine involving interviews. Bi-monthly, involving interviews and much beside. And then there's a daily half-hour program that World now puts out called The World and Everything in It. And it's a mixture of 5 minutes of news and then some features, including a couple of weeks ago, a two-part feature on courtship that involved some information from Patrick Henry students. And it has other things too, interviews and so forth. So I'd recommend those two things, the daily, The World and Everything in It, and then the bi-monthly, Mars Hill Audio. Other questions?
Hi. I was wondering about the current cultural response to radical Islam, especially with the recent Paris attacks.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what it is, critique it, and then tell us like an alternative?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, ever since 9/11, there's been this a dominant, what seems to me to be a dominant response that these attacks are evidence that we need to keep religion private. That as soon as religion and politics mix, bad things happen. So we need to further privatize religion. First of all, I think Christians need to stop using the word religion. There is no such thing as religion. What we call religion is the definition we have of religion is a really novel thing. There are two books that I'd recommend that develop this well. One, actually, William Cavanaugh, who's a Catholic theologian, who's written a number of books where he takes on this modern definition of religion. One of them is called The Myth of Religious Violence. Another one's called Theopolitical Imagination. But from a totally different angle, there's a new book by Peter Harrison, who's a historian of science, who's written a book called Territories of Science and Religion. And part of what he does is say what we call science and what we call religion in the 20th century and 21st century, those are new definitions. The point that Kavanaugh makes particularly is that the idea that religion needs to be kept private already presupposes something about the nature of religion. It already, in a sense, it's a circular thing. If you could travel back in time to the Roman Empire or the Aztec Empire, and let's say we go back to we go back in time, set the Wayback Machine, Sherman, and we go back and we've just witnessed a gory human sacrifice by Aztecs. And then you ask, as a good journalist, you ask the Aztec priest, are you doing this for political reasons or religious reasons? They would have looked at you, what in the world are you talking about?
I'd say, here's one more victim.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah, you look good. The idea that you could separate what we call religion and what you call politics is a novel, that's an invention of modernity. The very definition of the word secular, I gave a talk, in fact, at Georgetown recently. Rod Dreher was in town doing a thing for his Benedict option idea. And I talked about the invention of the idea of the secular. The word secular used to mean temporal, not theology free. And only beginning in the 18th century does secular mean a space that is free from theology and, God has nothing to do with this space. God or the gods have nothing to do with this space. Secular meant just temporal. So you could talk about Christian secular leaders without being paradoxical or contradictory. I think that I think Christians need to really start understanding that the deck is stacked against, as long as we accept the conventional understanding of religion and secular, that the deck is always going to be stacked against us, and the marginalization and privatizing of Christian conviction is going to become more and more severe. And that's why while I'm grateful for people who are trying to defend religious liberty, it's a stopgap measure because it effectively involves tacit assent to the definition of religion that is part of what got us into this mess in the first place. Now, so the typical response to Islam and Islamic violence is this is what religion does when it gets public. I'd want to say, well, there aren't any Amish people blowing up buildings or shooting people. There aren't any, when you hear about suicide bombers, you don't immediately think, a Methodist. It could have been a Methodist. So all religions there is no such thing as religion. I think it was Alan Jacobs told me about a study he saw once. Somebody did research to figure out what do all the things called religions have in common. And after years of extensive research, he found out the only thing they had in common is they all involved the use of candles at some point. So, so I think, and unfortunately publicly, we can't say right now, or at least we're told we can't say, that there's a great deal of difference between Christian teaching and Muslim teaching. So I think that maybe this is an occasion. I've often asked, why does God allow Islam? I mean, it's a more mysterious question than why are we creatures who need to eat in order to live? Why does God allow Islam? My friend Peter Leithart wrote an essay after 9/11 in which he suggested, First Things refused to publish it, by the way. He suggested that very tentatively, speculatively, that Islam, the title of the essay was The Mirror of Christendom. And he said Islam is, serious Muslims never got the Enlightenment memo that religion must be privatized. And we think that's because they're more primitive. and that if only they could live, they need a reformation and an enlightenment so that they could realize that religion needs to be privatized. Bill Kavanaugh says the interesting question is not the politicization of Islam, but the religionization of Christianity. So Peter kind of suggests that Islam is a rebuke to the Western Church for allowing the faith in the King of Kings and Lord of Lords to become entirely privatized and marginalized. But it's a rebuke from a faith that doesn't have a Trinity or incarnation, or grace as we understand it. So it seems to me that it's not surprising that it will be more likely to issue in acts of violence than Orthodox Christianity is. That's not to let Christianity off the hook by any means, but there are substantive teachings about the nature of God, the nature of God's relationship to creation. Well, just the nature of God, the fact that love, intra-Trinitarian love is the fundamental reality that's there. So I don't know if that really answers your question or not, but I think that this is an opportunity for clarity, for Christians to assert some kind of clarity and basically say, no, we're not going to live with this generic religion label anymore. It's just not helpful. It's not clarifying, and it's not helpful, let alone true.
Well, that's an important and true note on which to end, which we have to do right now. So please join me in thanking Ken for coming here.
Thank you. Thank you, Marvin.
Good, and I hope to see more of you tomorrow evening when we'll have Carl Zinsmeister, who is really a fascinating guy with a background in Iraq, a background in the White House, a background in philanthropy, a background in rowing, and doing many, many other things. Really an interesting guy. See you then, I hope. Thank you.